But first, it didn't get too much of a run in our media this past week, but in Britain, up to 80 of Boris Johnson's own MPs signalled their displeasure at constantly being passed over when it comes to coronavirus-related laws. Now, they're not happy being overlooked by a small executive that's increasingly dealing with the virus by decree, rather than the traditional method which sees ideas taken to the representatives of the people, that is the Parliament, then debated, amended and finally voted into law. Now, so far, we haven't heard the same concerns expressed by Australia's backbench MPs, but in both state and federal parliaments, the same trend, I think, is afoot, and I also think it's of concern. Ever since COVID lobbed on our radar back in January, our political class have been hoovering up greater and greater powers. COVID has proved a super phosphate, really, when it comes to the size of government, stimulating a depth of growth into our everyday lives not seen since the war. And to an extent, yes, some aspects of Big Brother are justified when confronting a viral pandemic. But just like in the UK, whilst the size of government and its reach into our daily lives gets bigger and deeper, all that power is being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. The rise of so-called delegated legislation has become a hallmark of Australia's response to COVID. And as the Centre for Public Integrity says, delegated legislation has doubled over the past 30 years, but it's gone into overdrive lately. And of concern, this has happened in tandem with a rise in secrecy surrounding official decision-making during the pandemic. It's now almost impossible to get access to the evidence that's the basis for massive life-changing policies like Melbourne's curfew or indeed state border closures. And add to that the creation of the National Cabinet and the rise to prominence of a small band of unelected officials basically being handed the keys to power, certainly by the premiers, parliaments and the bulk of our elected representatives have basically been sidelined. Now, I hope the Australian public aren't so apathetic that post-COVID they're willing to accept this as the new normal. With the pandemic leaving our young with massive debts and diminished job prospects, we mustn't also leave them a legacy of diminished, less representative democracy too. All right, well, let's bring in the panel. Sam, what do you make of all that?
Look, I think you're absolutely right, and good on you for raising it. I've been really worried over the last couple of months as this pandemic has worn on. And when it first happened, I think I was, along with the rest of the country, saying, OK, well, you know, let's do what we need to do, right? Like, I don't want to get the thing. I don't want my parents to get the thing.
Let's charter territory.
That's right. Let's just shut it down. As it's worn on and on and on, and things have not loosened up, despite, in a lot of cases, the numbers not being there to support these continually draconian measures, it's become a real worry. I tell you the other thing that it's given rise to that again, I look at with a degree of amusement. It's this rise in Australia, and they've had it in America for a while, but in Australia, it's this rise of sort of identity partisanship.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is, in America, you say, well, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and that's sort of who you are. Here we have, oh, well, I vote Labor or I vote Liberal, and OK, that's what I happen to do every 3 years, and let's get on with life. Now, I'm seeing it much more in the case of the pandemic with the I Stand With Dan crowd, where it doesn't matter what this guy says, he's absolutely right. Now, I'm a Labor guy, and I agree with 100% of what he says in some parts, but not every time. You know,
we are becoming Team Blue and Team Red.
That's right.
Without any exclusion.
And it's fair and reasonable enough to stand up and say, well, hold on. You know, I vote for the guy and I'd like the guy, but I think he's gone too far here or there. But a lot of these guys, especially on Twitter, and I know that's the internet sewer, I get that, but it is one of these things of, I think people just need to take a step back and apply a little bit of objectivity to some of these things.
Now, Prue, what do you make of this, particularly when it comes to the secrecy side of things? There's very little being done, isn't there, about opening up the information upon which government decision is changing our lives irreparably.
And they're getting away with it, as this so-called inquiry into the Melbourne fiasco with Dan Andrews and all his Alzheimer's public servants, you know, being let off the hook, it appears. There's no scrutiny anymore. At least with Parliament, there was scrutiny. Yeah. And it really is a concern because, you know, we have these coercive powers now the police are embracing, particularly in Victoria, where they've just gone too far. And if you're a conscientious objector, as so many people are now, who are fed up in Victoria in particular, with this incredible, legislation that's been brought in that really means that they're prisoners in their own homes and can't go out, readily without a mask and social distancing, and can't sit on a park bench. I mean, it's just gone to the extreme. So I think we have to be so vigilant and make sure that they become accountable and that we aren't prepared to do this in the longer term. We'll be good little Vegemites to an extent, but really it's not going to wash. And we'll all have to be taking to the streets if they don't swing back these incredible powers.
I agree with you. Daisy, now, I mean, you're up there in Anastasia Palaszczuk's Queensland, where, of course, the border, you'll speak about this later, the border closure is the big issue. But, again, the evidence to justify this, the medical evidence, just hasn't been made available. No one can test it. We're just told, oh, Dr Jeanette Young knows best, and so cop it. Well, she might know best, but if she does, prove it, put it on the table.
Well, exactly, and that is what has frustrated me so much about these border closures. The medical advice for them is just not there, and I'll elaborate on that later in my editorial. But certainly with Jeanette Young, remember when there was all that terrible hoo-ha about those poor people who couldn't come up to Queensland for funerals, etc. But Tom Hanks and his film crew and the AFL and everyone was allowed in. I mean, she made decisions on that based purely on economics rather than public health, and Anastasia Palaszczuk kept fobbing off the responsibility to her. People said, Premier Palaszczuk, do something about this, and she said, it's not my decision to make. It's not my decision to make. But the thing is, under the legislation in Queensland, I believe the Act was from something like 2005, in these situations, it actually isn't the Premier's decision to make. It is whoever is the Chief Health Officer, in this case, Jeanette Young. So Premier Palaszczuk, while she was roundly criticised for shirking the blame, she was correct. So we're in a situation in Queensland now. This act has been invoked where an unelected official, and she is only, yes, sure, she's an expert, we say she's an expert, but there are a lot of experts out there who have a lot of different opinions on the same thing. It's one set of opinions. Who is holding her accountable? She's an unelected official, and she's in charge of making these completely life-changing decisions, like shutting the borders, which has grossly affected people's lives, certainly mine, with so much, close friends and family in Sydney. My fiance and I have had to postpone our wedding for 12 months, which I know it's a small fry issue in the scheme of things, but it was very disappointing and frustrating. But she's an unelected official, and a frightening number of people up here in Queensland seem perfectly okay with that. And I think it's because they've been so terrified by the government that this virus is going to kill you if it comes near you, etc., that they're just kind of happy to be bossed around by these draconian policies. It's a worry.
There seems to be that. I mean, Sam, you ran for Parliament, of course. You would have been a backbencher straight away, as most parliamentarians are when they go in. I mean, why is there 80 of the Tory MPs saying, well, hang on, we are part of the Parliament. We're the elected representatives, Boris and Cabinet. You can't just rule like Mussolini. This is a democracy, and there is time for Parliament to look at this, and we should, as a Parliament, express the will of the people on legislation. Yet here, there's been basically radio silence from the backbench.
I think that has a lot to do with the two traditions of the Parliament. In the British Parliament, they don't have as regimented a voting structure on either side as we do here. So it's relatively common to get members of Parliament crossing the floor on all sorts of issues, and there are things that just sort of bubble up like this, and we just don't have that tradition in Australia. But I do think this is the logical endpoint of 50 years of degrading trust in our political institutions. I mean, you look at the Reserve Bank of Australia. It's one of the most trusted institutions in the country. Now, similarly, all the things that, you and Daisy have said about unelected officials, well, they are unelected officials, and it's their job. They are the main setters of monetary policy in this country. Well, we delegated that authority to them officially, in 1996 or 1997, and it's been that way for 20-something years. So, it's that logical point where we run our politicians, and being a politician is it's an ugly thing. It's a slur to say someone's political
Well, so many
or a
of them are, Sam. That's the problem. You know, we have the calibre of politicians we have in this country, by and large, is, you know, not great. There are some exceptions, notably, but, you know, I think it's really interesting that what this coronavirus has done in the year 2020 has given us a lot of vision about the fact that federation, our, you know, state system is not working, or if it is, it's working in, you know, for all these little Hitlers who are now, you know, drunk with power. Look at Mark McGowan, look at Andrews, look at Palaszczuk. I mean, it's quite terrifying how they're not worried about the good of the greater nation. They're worried about their own little patches and the politics surrounding it. And this is where it's really scary, and that's the calibre of the politician we're dealing with now. It's all about getting re-elected. It's not what's good for the country.
I wonder, Prue, if some of this, though, is in some respects a butt-covering exercise for the politicians, in that they can say, well, we hand this decision over to Dr. whoever or Reserve Bank whoever. If it goes well, well, the system's working. If it doesn't go well, not our problem. Like I was saying when I was last on the panel about using all of these outside consultants, the PwCs and the Ernst Youngs of this world. You've got a perfectly decent public service, but get them to do it. And, of course, if the you-know-what hits the fan, blame them.
And, of course, if they're inept, and a lot of them are career politicians, they've never, you know, paid a person in their life. They wouldn't have a clue what really is going on in the real world because they're in their own little bubbles and they're surrounded by, you know, apparatchiks and, you know, yes men and women. So, you know, they just take advice because they're bloody lazy or dumb, a lot of them. And as you say, they otherwise just say, well, you know, I know nothing. It wasn't my problem. It's terrifying.
Certainly seems to be.
I think also in Australia, we've been so, what I like to call, wonderfully spoilt in our country. You know, we're a democracy, we have compulsory voting, which tends to keep the politics rather moderate. You don't see sort of the extremes of either side massively in the mainstream, in the political arena, etc. So my worry is that Australia is they don't have that sort of necessary suspicion that I think everyone should have of government and of politicians. Now, I have a lot of respect for politicians. It is my nightmare job. I have no idea how they do what they do. But in a lot of them, there is at least a tiny little streak of megalomania there. You know, if you want to be a politician, you have to at least like kind of being in charge and making those decisions. And often that can grow particularly toxic, you know, if given the opportunity. And certainly, I'm not saying that certain politicians in Australia are megalomaniacs, but certainly we've seen these power grabs by Premier Mark McGowan, by Anastasia Palaszczuk, there's certainly Daniel Andrews with his curfew, etc., that I find quite alarming. And because Australians are so wonderfully spoiled, I don't think enough people are kind of making that distinction. And that's what worries me for the future, that this giant big government overreach into people's personal lives is going to be normalised because of people's complacency.
Yeah, well said. Well, I think it was Chris Uhlmann that said there's a little authoritarian in all of us. We'll see if there's some in Prue.